The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced what he says amounts to the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. The change in policy comes ahead of his visit to Washington on Thursday to meet US President Donald Trump. Spending on defence will increase to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 3% by 2030. It means that from 2027 the UK will spend an extra £13.4 billion a year on defence. The money for the uplift in 2027 will come from the international aid budget, which will be cut from 0.5 to 0.3% of national income.
I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027. Yeah. And we will maintain that for the rest of this Parliament. And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we also face enemies that are sophisticated in cyber attacks, sabotage, even assassination. And so our intelligence and security services are an increasingly vital part of protecting both us and our allies. So on top of the funding of 2.5% that I've just announced, going forward we will recognise the incredible contribution of our intelligence and security services to the defence of the nation, which means taken together we will be spending 2.6% on our defence from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we must go further still. I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence. So, subject to economic and fiscal conditions and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament.
With me is our presenter of the Security Brief, Mikey Case, here in the studio. These numbers won't make a lot of sense to our viewers. They don't actually make a lot of sense to us, I don't think. But I think what we do get an impression of here is that they are borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. So there's money coming out of the international aid budget that will go to defence. The bottom line is it enough?
Well, I mean, that's the number one question. When we say, is it enough, what are we talking about? Because when I was part of the Strategic Defence and Security Review about a decade ago, the thing that drives military spending and therefore military capability is foreign policy objectives. So technically, the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, or the State Department in the US should be giving an idea of where the priorities are in terms of threats around the world. We spoke about this yesterday. There was this big conversation during the SDSR, this was back in 2012, of the war versus a war, the war being Iraq and Afghanistan, and the type of military capability that was required in order to win that war. So counterinsurgency, basically. You're looking at counter-IED, close air support, battlefield helicopters, so on and so forth. Versus a war being a conventional war that the UK and European countries and the United States still needs to be equipped and have the capability for to be able to make sure that they can deter someone like Putin, yet at the same time win Iraq and Afghan war. So the big question here is that when Keir Starmer's talking about a raise of 2.3 to 2.5, what does that actually mean in terms of defence spending on what capability? And then if you have that conversation, the defence industrial base in the UK needs to be taken into consideration. Are the projects, the big procurement projects, someone like the F-35 fighter or a new tank or a new warship, they're big procurement projects. They're not going to happen overnight. They're not going to happen every year. So what's the defence expenditure on, and how is it designed to deter what I assume is a threat from Russia?
Well, precisely. And that analysis was supposedly being done by the Defence Spending Review, the Strategic Defence Review, which we still don't have. And Jonathan Beale, our defence correspondent, was just in here saying it wasn't meant to happen this way. We're getting the numbers before we get the strategy and the threat that we actually face. So it's an odd way to make the announcement. the only conclusion you can draw is that he's done it this way because he's due in Washington on Thursday.
Absolutely. I mean, this is all about optics. The fact that he can go to Washington and tell Trump and his administration that he has already approved a defense expenditure rise of 0.2% is really all that Trump wants to hear. Now, I mean, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? I mean, how will that affect the relationship with the US? How will it affect the here and now, which is Europe scrabbling to try and find some form of security strategy in order to A, support Ukraine and B, deter
I mean, it's
Putin.
strategic, isn't it? Because it allows Donald Trump, from the position that he's got himself into, that he's withdrawing from Europe, that it's Europe that must carry the burden. He's able to say to his voters, to his supporters, look, I've got the Europeans to go again. We've got another lift in defence spending. I'm getting something from them. Is the hope on this side that it encourages him to stick with NATO and to stick with American deployment within Europe?
I mean, I personally don't think that the UK rising its defence budget by 2.2% is going to alter the way that the Trump
Yeah, but you've got a
administration...
200 billion uplift announced by the incoming Chancellor in Germany. If he can get it through the Bundestag, we've heard similar noises from President Macron. We've heard from Denmark that they're now up over 3%. The Poles are spending well over 3%. You see it right across Europe in reaction to what Donald Trump is pushing.
But that's a strategy of isolating themselves from a dependence on the US. I mean, the reason why everyone's scrabbling in Europe is now, whether it's the nuclear arsenal, whether it's the 10 carriers that the US have, that no other country in the world has, whether it's the the size of the forces and the backstop that the US has provided since World War II, Europe can no longer rely on that. I mean, Trump and his administration, Hegseth, Kellogg, J.D. Vance, they have made it quite clear that whatever happens, whatever deal is made, that Europe will have to step up and provide security after that deal. Now, I mean, we could go back to 1991. We can go back to the demise of the Soviet Union and the fragmentation of that, and we can talk about how Putin has been antagonised.
At a point, incidentally, when defence spending in the UK, 91, was at 3.8%.
Right.
And well above that during the Cold War years. So that gives you a comparison.
It does. And defence is being cut. I mean, the Danish Prime Minister was on the other day, and she was basically talking about how defence had been cut and cut and cut and how it must never happen again. And then she introduced a rise in the Danish spending as well. So, it's certainly been a theme. It's been a trend of defence expenditure coming down. And now Europe is scrabbling to not only give the right optics in terms of increasing expenditure, but the big question, Christian, that we've been talking about is this isn't just about equipment. This is about capability. And you might be able to buy a tank or a warship or a jet, but you've got to put personnel on that. You've got to train the personnel on that. You've got to equip the personnel on that.
Herein is a really important point for our viewers, because I think when you talk about billions in spending, people think, that's going to go to new equipment. There is there's a huge gulf between equipment and the money you have to spend in order to sustain and deliver that equipment.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the US defense budget, for example, 39% of the US defense budget, which is about 850 billion, not adjusted for inflation. That's another conversation that I find hard to get my head around.
An important conversation in the context of what we're talking, though.
Yeah, because 850 billion on the US defense budget, including inflation, is 1.1% less than the previous year. Another conversation, as we said. But to go back to the point, 39% of that budget is operations and maintenance. That's how much it costs, around 310 billion, to just operate the jets, the tanks, the warships, and maintain all the spares, all the mechanical engineering. Taking it offline and doing all of the servicing.
So when Johnny says, he was just saying, we only have 14 long-range delivery systems in the UK. Given in mind what has been used in Ukraine, we only have 14 of those. What do you have to put around those long-range delivery systems in order to make them battle-ready?
Well, I mean, there's the conversation on the unit itself, so, the launcher and the missile. And then if you're procuring that type of equipment, you have to look at a what's called tepid oil. So tepid oil, the T stands for training, the E stands for equipment, the P stands for personnel, the O stands for organisation, infrastructure. So for example, if you've got a jet, you need to put it in a hangar. Logistics, the maintenance, the spares. A lot of procurement comes with what's CapEx, which is capital expenditure, which is the cost of buying the piece of equipment. And then there's a 10-year plan, which has got a budget tied to it, that is for spares, maintenance, engineering, upgrades, et al. So, we're talking about 0.2% of GDP, but when it then comes to capability, it's not just about a unit cost, it's about what is the cost of operating that piece of equipment for 10 years.
And just finally, troops. I mean, I worked it out the other day. We have less troops than 0.1% of the British population. We have the lowest number of troops since the Napoleonic War, about 68,000. How many troops do we need?
It's a great question. I've not done the math on that, if I'm honest. I mean, need for what? I mean, how many troops do we need to?
Which comes back to the Defence Review.
Right. I mean, and this is what the Defence Review is all about. The FCO will give foreign policy objectives. The military would then look at that and look at those threats and go that when I was part of the SDR, we broke it down into long, medium, and short-term operations, and then enduring and non-enduring. So non-enduring was around 6 months. Enduring means ad infinitum. And then you basically you look at
peacekeeping force in Ukraine would be ad infinitum.
It would certainly be enduring. When I say ad infinitum, I mean obviously there's that you have to put some form of end state on that and then equip a capability in order to do that. But they're the questions that need to be asked at the moment is what's the threat? How long is the threat going to last for? What is the location of the threat? Who are the partners involved in the threat? And then what is the capability required by each of the partners in order to counter that threat? I'll be curious to know what the answers to that are from the current Parliament.
That is the big picture on the statement that we just had, and in mind of what Mikey's just told us. It does feel very much like this 0.2% is only a stopgap on the way to 3, possibly beyond 3 in the coming years.